Hello, everybody, and welcome to Law Bite number 344, dated March the 5th, 2022. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This Law Bite is entitled Parliamentary Government in Maryland. Before I begin, however, I'd like to formally invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Juarez Lee Shelton, M.A. And in addition to that, please also click on the little notification bell immediately to the right of the subscribe button. In doing so, you will receive notifications when I post new, exciting, and enlightening videos in history, law, political science, theology, and philosophy. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for allowing me to teach you. You're the best, and thank you in advance for your subscriptions and likes. So again, this video is entitled Parliamentary Government in Maryland. Now, you all probably know if you've watched any of my videos in the past that I am very interested in how government works. I love government, especially the legislative and judicial branches of government. And one thing I've always, thought about, in my free time and, other instances is how parliamentary government would work in the USA. All right. Of course, we don't have any parliamentary governments in the USA whatsoever, not at the federal level, and certainly not at the state level. Okay, but having being someone that has always admired the British Westminster-style parliamentary system, I've wondered, how would that work in America? Maybe at the federal level, maybe at the state level. So I decided to experiment and essentially redesign Maryland's state government into a Westminster-style parliamentary government. So as I go through this, you can see how Maryland's government will evolve from the traditional Republican-style government headed by a separate executive, all right, from the legislature, into a Westminster-style parliamentary government where the executive is derived from the legislative branch. A concept that's very alien to Americans. All right. We're not used to that here. All right. And if you've not taken a comparative government course in college or graduate school, it's going to be even more alien to you. So pay attention and let me know what you think. All right. So parliamentary government, like I said, is something that's a foreign concept to most Americans. It's a system that contrasts heavily with our own Republican governments, which have distinct separation of powers, okay? At the federal level in the USA and in all 50 states, we have the presidential-style Republican governments, all right? Presidential-style at the federal level with, gubernatorial analogs in all 50 states, all right? A separate executive, all right, a separate legislature, and a separate judicial branch. All right. These three distinct branches operate in independent spheres and serve to check and balance the power of the other two. All right. Most Americans understand, at least to a small extent, I'll go so far as to say, how their state government works and how the federal government works. All right. If you didn't pay attention in social studies class, you're about to get a refresher course, all right? So parliamentary governments, of course, if you are unaware, have a head of government that is separate from the head of state. Did you know that? All right. If you didn't, like I said, you're about to learn. Additionally, the head of government, all right, in a parliamentary system is typically known as a prime minister, all right, or a first minister, depending on the country, all right, or it may be known as a premier, all right. And that individual, all right, is derived from the legislative branch, all right, of the national government, all right, and is dependent upon that branch to remain in their position of authority. Okay, so under specific circumstances, the legislature can be dissolved by the head of state, all right, in a parliamentary system, which, depending on the country, the head of state can be a monarch, okay? The head of state can be a president whose powers are usually very, very, very limited, all right, having mostly a ceremonial office, okay? And, you know, that head of state can dissolve the legislature at the request of the head of government, and new elections can be called. That's one definite distinction in a parliamentary system versus a republican system. You know, elections aren't quite as fixed to happen on a very rigid timetable like we're used to here in the U.S. You know, the prime minister, for example, summons the head of state to dissolve parliament and call for new elections, maybe in a 2-year time frame, as opposed to a traditional 4-year time frame, all right, when an election would happen automatically in the U.S. You know, the prime minister in a parliamentary system, you know, having lost the confidence of his party and the majority of people in parliament, will summon to the governor general, let's say in Canada, to dissolve the parliament and call for new national elections. You know, its parliamentary system is very different, folks, than what you are used to here in the U.S. All right. So finally, there is a judicial branch that varies, you know, in its level of independence from the legislature. For example, the Supreme Court of Canada and the Canadian judiciary in general is far more independent in form and format than that of the judiciary in the United Kingdom. One could argue in Canada's case that independent judiciary is a result of the American influence upon the country. Canadians may or may not disagree with that, but hey, it is what it is. In spite of these differences from the type of presidential-style Republican system that we're used to here in the U.S., parliamentary governments can be republics, okay? Parliamentary republics, that is. That brings us to the prospect of parliamentary government in the U.S. state of Maryland, my native land. I myself, as I've said, have long been interested in the Westminster-style parliamentary system, ladies and gentlemen, which is very well established in places such as the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many, 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 many other countries around the world that were once part of the British Empire. Right? We're one of the very few countries in the world that used to be a part of the British Empire that did not adopt a parliamentary government. All right? We came close to it during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, but thankfully, in the minds of many, that idea did not fly. All right? So, both my curiosity and admiration for it have led me to consider what it would look like on America's shores. What would parliamentary government look like here in the United States? All right, specifically in the American states. For this experiment, I go no further than my own state of Maryland, like I said. And the parliamentary guidance comes from directly across America's border in Canada. Specifically, the governments presented in their 11 provinces. Before we begin the description, however, we address the potential constitutional issue arising from a U.S. state adopting a parliamentary-style Republican government. Now, if you want to turn to Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, it reads as follows. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. Okay? So basically what that means is the federal government is obligated to protect the Republican-style governments in all of the states and protect them against invasion, all right, obviously from a foreign power, and if the state requests it of the federal government, protect the state against domestic insurrections and uprisings, all right? But the bottom line here, for the purposes of this video, we're focusing on the very first part of this section, which says the U.S. shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. So the federal government is obligated to make sure that all 50 states have a Republican form of government. Now, what constitutes a republican form of government is a political question, ladies and gentlemen, not a judicial one. The only time the Supreme Court has ever considered this question, but then dismissed it out of lack of jurisdiction, being that it was a political question, was in 1849 with the case of Luther versus Borden, when the court was asked to determine whether or not Rhode Island's government was a republican form of government within the meaning of the Constitution. The court, however, dodged that issue quite wisely and left that to the president and Congress to decide what constitutes a republican form of government. Can you imagine the Supreme Court doing that today? Yeah, me either. So, in any case, that being said, the United States Constitution does not define what constitutes a republican form of government, all right, that is constitutionally acceptable per se. Therefore, in my opinion, I'm making the argument that there's wide latitude for interpretation with what constitutes a republican form of government in the United States. To support that, parliamentary republics exist throughout the world. Great examples include in Ireland, Germany, Italy, Finland, Ethiopia, India, Pakistan, Greece, and others. Thus, Parliament and Republic can sleep in the same bed, all right? And they don't have to wear protection because they are naturally one, all right? So, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, Republican is defined as having the characteristics of a republic. Next, republic is defined as a government having a chief of state who is not a monarch and who in modern times is usually a president. And number two, a government in which supreme power resides in a body of citizens entitled to vote and is exercised by elected officers and representatives responsible to them and governing according to law. Based on these definitions, a parliamentary system in the state of Maryland, which would not have a monarch, obviously, and has elected representatives, would constitute an acceptable form of republican government. Technically, my theory is not wrong, as the matter has never been attempted and has never been ruled upon by the Supreme Court, nor has Congress ever put out any sort of resolution or passed any legislation declaring what types of governments would be constitutionally permissible under Article 4, Section 4. My theory is no less correct than any other legal scholar. So, moving on. In the state of Maryland, we have the typical Republican state government found throughout the United States, with an executive known as a governor, a bicameral legislature known as the General Assembly, and a three-tiered court system where the state Supreme Court is known as the Court of Appeals. Again, we draw our inspiration from the Westminster-style parliamentary governments in the Canadian provinces, which are analogous to U.S. states in form and function. These provinces have a unicameral legislature, all right? Provincial Assembly consisting of elected representatives chosen by the voters. That body is presided over by a speaker of the assembly. The leader of the political party that has the most seats in the legislature is known as the premier and leads the executive branch of the province. All right, he's the de facto executive of the province, he or she. They are invited to form a government in the name of Queen Elizabeth II by the lieutenant governor, all right, upon becoming the leader of the party with the most seats in that provincial assembly, all right? The premier and his or her cabinet then form the executive council. Members of that council are chosen by the premier and appointed by the lieutenant governor, all right? Now, I might have totally lost you at this point. You're probably saying, premier, lieutenant governor, what in the world? So, the lieutenant governor is the official representative of the British monarch in each province, okay? This individual is appointed by the Governor General of Canada on the advice of the Canadian Prime Minister. For the record, The Governor General of Canada is the official representative of Queen Elizabeth II in Canada. For those who are unaware, Queen Elizabeth II is the Queen of Canada. She is that country's head of state, but she is not the head of government. The head of government in Canada is the Prime Minister, who the current office holder is Justin Trudeau. All right? For those who are unaware, to alleviate any confusion. All right? So the Lieutenant Governor, all right, a subordinate to the Canadian Governor General, has specific duties outside of the Premier of the province, who, remember, the Premier is the head of government in the province and is the de facto executive, whereas the Lieutenant Governor is officially the head of state in the province, all right, in the name of Queen Elizabeth II, all right? The Lieutenant Governor has specified duties outside of the Premier and serves at the pleasure of the Governor General of Canada. Additionally, the province has a separate and functional judicial branch staffed by appointed judicial officers. Canada also has a predominantly two-party system like the U.S., so that too would be a trait that most Americans are already used to. While overwhelmingly structured like the system in the Canadian provinces, we will certainly have our own flair on the whole thing, so to speak. All right? Now, to adopt a Westminster-style parliamentary government in the state of Maryland using the Canadian province model, like I said, modifications will need to happen with Maryland's state government. All right. The spirit of influence comes from the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, which in my opinion has a lot of similarities to the U.S. state of Maryland. What are they, you may ask? Well, like Nova Scotia, Maryland is a small, somewhat provincial Atlantic state that is consistently left-leaning in its politics. All right? Very similar to Nova Scotia in Canada. That being said, we start with the legislative branch to be modified in Maryland. All U.S. states, as I'm sure you remember from social studies class back in the day, except Nebraska, have a bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house and a lower house. All right? Thus, in at least one U.S. state, a unicameral legislature exists, Nebraska, since 1937, having abolished their state senate that year to save money during the Depression. So, moving on to the full-scale alteration of state government. In Maryland, the upper house is known as the Senate, and the lower house is known as the House of Delegates. As the Canadian provinces all have unicameral legislatures, we hereby, in this scenario, abolish the Maryland State Senate, leaving the House of Delegates as the sole legislative body for the state. This body will remain in session for at least 6 months throughout the year, at least, and may remain in session as long as it sees fit. The 141-member House of Delegates will continue to be presided over by a speaker chosen by a majority of the delegates elected to the House. The speaker will thus almost certainly be of the majority party, but unlike the American tradition of the speaker leading a partisan agenda, the speaker in a parliamentary system is a neutral individual whose role is more like an impartial judge, keeping order and not deliberately furthering the interests of either party in the House. That's a very big difference, folks, because the speaker in all 50 U.S. states and at the federal level is a very partisan individual, almost always, who leads a particular party's agenda, Democrat or Republican. Very big difference here, so follow closely. All right? So after each general election, the House will proceed to elect a speaker who will serve, okay, a 4-year term with the rest of that body. All right? The speaker will not vote on legislation unless there is a tie in the chamber. That's another difference. In the U.S., speakers typically have the power to vote on legislation. Parliamentary systems, that's not the case unless there's a tie. Remember, the speaker is neutral. All right? Under the current leadership in Maryland, that speaker would be the Honorable Adrian Jones. Members of the House of Delegates will continue to be elected from legislative districts throughout the state and serve no more than a 4-year renewable term unless the assembly is dissolved sooner and a general election held. Now, if a general election is held under a 4-year time period, the speaker may potentially lose their office as well. All right. Remember, with each new session of the General Assembly, in this case, the House of Delegates, they must elect a speaker. All right. So if the new General Assembly chooses not to retain the speaker from the past assembly, so be it. All right. Now, of the political parties represented in the House after a general election, the leader of the party holding the most seats after a general election shall become the head of government in Maryland and be referenced as the Premier of Maryland. This person is otherwise known as the Majority Leader in American legislative tradition. All right. That person under the current scheme would be Delegate Eric Lutka, Democrat from the 14th District, which represents the area of Montgomery County. So, this individual would effectively be the de facto head of government in the state of Maryland, not the governor. Okay, we're in the legislature here. Remember, we're in a parliamentary system where the leader of the party with the most seats represented, all right, becomes the head of government. All right. So, of course, in Maryland, that person is going to be a Democrat almost certainly, without question. I mean, you could bet your whole life savings on that one. All right. So the individual, once again, the leader of the party, okay, that has the most seats after a general election, the leader of that party who has the most seats in the House of Delegates after a general election, that party leader becomes the de facto head of government in the state of Maryland under a parliamentary system. All right? The de facto, not the de jure. All right? The de facto meaning unofficially. All right? And despite this, however, this is the person who calls the shots. This is the de facto executive of the state. All right? So after a general election, follow with me, the governor of Maryland shall invite the premier to form a government in the name of the people of the state. That government shall consist of cabinet members who shall be incumbent members of the House of Delegates. So the premier will name members of their administration, their cabinet, from incumbent members of the House of Delegates. One of these cabinet ministers shall be designated by the premier as the deputy premier. The deputy shall serve at the pleasure of the premier, serving as premier when the incumbent cannot perform their duties, and may be assigned other duties as needed. As the head of government, the premier is the de facto executive of the state, like I said, directing the legislative agenda, and as a member of the General Assembly, may vote on legislation. So, the premier, in spite of being the de facto executive of the state of Maryland, is still a member of the General Assembly and may introduce and vote on legislation. Very different than what we're used to here in the U.S. The president is not a member of the executive branch, and he or she cannot vote on legislation. All right, the governor of Maryland is not a member of the state legislature, cannot introduce a bill per se. You can propose it, all right, but cannot introduce the bill. The premier, however, is a member of the General Assembly and can introduce and vote on legislation, a marked difference from what we have. Okay, so you see there is the no separation, real separation here between the executive and the legislative branch, officially, all right? The executive comes from the legislature, and the executive may vote on legislation, all right? So, the premier shall remain the head of government in the state unless at the time of the next general election, which can be no more than 4 years from the previous one, unless his or her party loses a majority of seats in the House, or a motion of no confidence is introduced and passed by a majority of members in the House. Now, if you don't know what a motion of no confidence is, that, ladies and gentlemen, is simply a motion filed where at least one, most likely a whole lot more, member of the House has decided that the current government really has no more mandate to govern because they are totally inept and incompetent, and we have no confidence in your ability to govern the state anymore. So that motion is introduced, all right? And if a majority of members vote in the affirmative, if a vote of no confidence passes against the premier, they are required to either resign from their position or request the governor of the state to dissolve the General Assembly and call for a general election. For the record, most no confidence motions fail. But in the event that one should pass, the governor, upon the, request of the premier, will typically be called to call for a general election. All right. The governor may refuse to do this, however, if an election has recently been held or if there's another leader who can likely gain the confidence of the House of Delegates. If a dissolution request is refused, the premier, bottom line, must resign. And the governor may invite the leader of another coalition party to form a new government. Coalition is simply when two or more parties unite to form a government if the larger one doesn't have enough seats, all right, to effectively get their agenda across. So they ally themselves with another smaller party to be able to have a solid majority. In Maryland, we have the Democratic and Republican Party. We also have very minor parties, but they are not really represented. So essentially, the coalition aspect is not really a part of the American political tradition. So in this case, all right, coalitions aren't really that relevant. But, in a two-party system, we will have a majority being Democrat or Republican. And even if you just have one vote in the majority that gives you that majority, you have a majority. Be happy and you can govern, assuming that all your members are on board with things. So next, the member of the House who is the leader of the second most numerous party in the chamber will be known as the leader of the opposition. In the American political scheme, this person is typically known as the minority leader. And under our current scheme in Maryland, this individual would be Delegate Jason Buckle, all right, of Allegheny County, all right? And under our scheme in Maryland, the opposition would almost certainly be the Republican Party at all times. The leader of the opposition, like the premier, shall designate one of their members of the party as the deputy leader of the opposition and shall function in place of the leader of the opposition when they are unable to perform their duties and may be assigned other duties as required. The leader of the opposition shall form a shadow cabinet consisting of members of their party in the House of Delegates. So they're mirroring exactly what the premier does in the majority. So that takes us to the executive branch. The executive power of the state of Maryland shall be vested in a governor, ladies and gentlemen, who shall be elected on a nonpartisan ballot by the people of the state every 4 years. Should no candidate for governor receive a majority, the two highest shall face a runoff election where whoever gets at least 51% of the vote will become governor. The governor shall be the de jure, aka official, head of state in Maryland. Notice I said head of state, not head of government. Governor is the head of state in my scenario, but not the head of government. Now, of course, in our current actual system, governor is both the head of state and head of government as well. All right. So under my system, the person would, of course, be Governor Larry Hogan. The governor's 4-year term shall not be affected by early dissolutions of the General Assembly. and calls for general elections under a 4-year period. All right. So even if the governor dissolves the General Assembly, his or her term remains 4 years, and governor may serve an unlimited amount of 4-year terms. All right. As the governor is nonpartisan and does not further any political agenda, there is no real issue with this happening. All right. The governor shall be the commander-in-chief of the state's defense forces, and on the advice of the premier, appoints and commissions state judges, notaries public, heads of state boards, and sundry officers. Additionally, the governor shall provide executive assent to bills passed by the General Assembly within 10 days of receipt. If he fails to sign within that time, the bill will become law automatically without his signature. Should the governor veto a bill, which is very rare in parliamentary systems, the head of state almost never refuses legislation passed by the democratically elected representatives of the people. Should the governor veto a bill, a 3/5 majority override shall be necessary to supplant the governor's veto, all right, in the House of Delegates, all right? It is the duty of the governor to call the General Assembly into session annually, all right, and call for a general election should the premier fail a no confidence vote. Lastly, should the premier fail a no confidence vote, the governor may refuse to call a general election and force the resignation of the premier and appoint a new premier who commands the confidence of the majority party. For clarity purposes, the governor functions in a largely ceremonial role as head of state. Unlike the premier, who directs the state's partisan legislative agenda, the governor performs no such functions. Outside of signing legislation and calling the General Assembly into session, the governor largely operates on the actions of the premier. All right. Now, the judicial power, let's address that, shall remain vested in a court of appeals, a court of special appeals, circuit courts, district courts, and orphans courts. Okay. All judicial elections, except retention elections for the 2 appellate courts, will be eliminated. And all judges will be appointed by the governor on the advice of the premier. Judges of the circuit and orphans courts who previously could face contested retention elections would move to simple retention elections to retain their offices. Retention elections for judges, by the way, are when the people simply vote yes or no whether or not the judge should remain in office. The judges do not have challengers for their seats. District court judges would continue to be reappointed by the governor on the advice of the premier once their terms have expired. Lastly, the mandatory judicial retirement age of 70 would be abolished and replaced with a mandatory retirement age of 80 if a judge has not stepped down by that point. All judges not retired by age 80 shall retire by December 31st of the year that they reach the age of 80. Okay? Retired judges could still be called to serve if they wish on a per diem basis. Lastly, judicial terms as they stand: 10 years for the Court of Appeals and the Court of Special Appeals, 15 years for the circuit court judges, 10 years for district court judges, and 4 years for orphans court judges shall remain unaltered. Therefore, this is the basic framework of government under a parliamentary system in the state of Maryland. With our 2-party system and the structure given, the Democratic Party would foreseeably have an even more permanent lockhold on Maryland's state government, depending on your political allegiance, for better or for worse. Outside of an unlikely radical rightward shift in the state's demographics, which is very unlikely in the foreseeable future, the Republican Party in Maryland would become little more than an opposition party that exists as a mere formality. All right? As you would expect, Democrats, unless their majority was very small or very weak, would likely have little incentive or desire to work with the official opposition, the Republican Party. So to review, the changes under a parliamentary system would be very evident in Maryland's state government. First, the General Assembly would be reduced from 2 houses to 1, the House of Delegates. Okay? Second, in place of the governor, the de facto governing power of the state would be vested in a premier, who is the leader of the majority party in the House of Delegates. Third, while the governor, who is elected separately, remains the head of state, he or she is largely ceremonial in function. While having certain specified duties that cannot be delegated, the governor operates largely on the actions of the premier of the state, who is the head of government, all right, and the state's de facto executive. In designing this government, I left in place as many American institutions as possible to keep it homegrown, okay, such as still electing the head of state, all right, which is may or may not be the case in parliamentary systems around the world, all right, especially obviously monarchs, all right, are not elected, okay. But I added the necessary parliamentary functions to allow it to be as authentic and as true to a traditional parliamentary system as possible. So, having heard all of that, would you approve of this parliamentary system if it were put before you as a voter? All right. And for the record, the people of Maryland could easily adopt such a system. Every 20 years, the General Assembly is required to put forth the question on the ballot for the people of Maryland whether or not we need to hold a constitutional convention. If that should pass, that we do, a parliamentary system could easily be drawn up and, if approved by the voters, take effect. So I thank you so much for listening to my somewhat lengthy video on parliamentary government in Maryland, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned a thing or two from it. If you have any questions or controversies, you can leave them down below, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. If you've not subscribed to my video at this point, please do so now. Juarez Lee Shelton, M.A. All right, and you'll get every time I post new, exciting, and enlightening videos, on these very interesting subjects in history, law, political science, theology, and philosophy. And last but not least, if you like this video, gain some insight, learn something, whatever the case may be, please drop me a like. These likes truly matter and mean more than what you realize when building a YouTube channel. So again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. Take care of yourself. Stay safe out there. I will talk to you at the next video, and I appreciate every ounce of privilege that you give me to teach you. Until next time, cheers.